As we gear up for the playoffs, like a lot of years, kind of think about what's on the line for all of the superstars in this league. And there's a lot. I think we're about to go to war here because I have no idea what's going to happen. And there's going to be some good players that lose early, and we're going to wonder what that means for them moving forward. But I was listening to Dame Lillard with JJ Redick and Tommy Alter the other day on their podcast, and it got me thinking kind of like how we talk about Dame. Because in general, when we talk about NBA stars, I think NFL quarterbacks fall into this too. We can be dicks. I can even be it sometimes. I'd like to think that I'm pretty fair if I decide that I'm going to be critical of somebody, and critical to the point where I'm like, I just don't know if you're one of those guys or if you're actually a number one in the kind of player a team can build around and win with. I won't say that unless I feel really good about it. And that's usually 1 or 2 seasons, rarely one. But we do say it about a lot of players. So when I think about how fair we can be, because honestly, if you have enough determination and time, you can kind of argue against everything, right? Any playoff run, this player's success, the team building that we've seen in recent NBA history that we're not seeing as much the last couple seasons. But we can definitely downgrade someone's accomplishment. Or we can downgrade their accomplishments if they don't win a ring, because that's super easy, right? Hey, he doesn't have a ring. Why am I supposed to be talking about him as one of the greats of all time or one of the top 5 players in the NBA? And maybe that's the value of a ring, right? Maybe the value of a ring is that we forget a lot of the little things. I remember Golden State with their first run, Doc Rivers saying, well, you know what? A lot of guys were hurt that they went up against. And you're like, okay, but every single playoff year, there's 1, maybe 2 dramatic injuries that changes the entire outcome. And like I said, maybe that's good. Maybe it's good that we forget these little things along the way. Granted, that team's fan base that's on the losing side, or maybe the winning side, but more likely the losing side will remember those little specific things that most of us won't forget. And again, like I said, maybe that's kind of cool. Maybe that's the best part of the accomplishment. Whether it's Durant's foot on the line against Giannis in Game 7, a reminder there, Durant had 48 points. And if his toe's behind the line and his 49 points, the Nets with that team beat the Bucks. And we're left sitting here watching Giannis win MVPs. If he doesn't win a title that year, who knows? Maybe they're more motivated, so you can't connect it all and say if he doesn't have that one, he'd never have one. But if Giannis didn't have one, we would talk about him very differently, even though he'd probably be the exact same player. Durant had 48. That's the most points ever in a Game 7 in NBA history. And like I said, if it's 49, maybe we're talking about players a lot differently. And in that playoff run, too, that was a lingering kind of hangover of me talking about Durant going, he's the best player. Missing time, he's not healthy. And then I think as if you listen to this podcast, you've heard me kind of transition going into like, I can't have it be Durant anymore, even though at his size, handle, pull up, dribble, and getting the shots that he gets and makes, I'm like, that's the special talent. Like that's beyond anybody else, but he just doesn't play enough at this point to put him ahead of Giannis anymore. I mean, he went for a cool 35, 10, and 5 in that series and they lost. And it's almost like that series doesn't even count for the Durant legacy unless you really are digging into it or doing a 2-hour podcast on Kevin Durant. The Ray Allen 3 against the Spurs that sent it to overtime. Spurs fans won't forget this, but Manu had a steal on what was a terrible turnover from LeBron under 30 seconds to go. And if you hated LeBron, boy, are you mad how that game turned out, because that would have been nice fodder for your anti-LeBron stance. You'd be like, oh, biggest spot, huge turnover. Manu goes the other way. He's fouled, and he actually missed a free throw that would have made it a 4-point game. Only made 1 or 2 after knocking down 2 earlier. So Ray's 3 wouldn't have meant anything, and that changed everything because then Miami gets their title with that group against the Spurs. Granted, they had already beat Oklahoma City, but, it's another ring. And it's the same as if you're talking about Brady. You're like, well, if this didn't happen, this didn't happen, this didn't happen. But it's like, yeah, but all those things happen because you're only focusing on the things you can take away from a player and not focusing on the other things that he could potentially have had if things had worked out at his side. So, like I said, maybe we should forget some of these smaller things because if you really wanted to, you could do it all day. And then all of a sudden you're just downgrading everybody. That doesn't seem like very much fun. Like, why are we even watching and talking about this sport? So as I mentioned at the top, I saw Lillard with Redick, and it was really good. And it got into kind of how we look at Dame. Like right now, just blink, whatever. Malcolm Gladwell. I say Dame Lillard. You say Dame Lillard to your group of NBA friends that are super into it. Like, what's the consensus? Right, man, he's really good. Look at the scoring numbers. Man, when he goes, like his guards go, like is he that far off the rest of those dudes? Maybe not, but there's no real playoff resume to get excited about. It's a Western Conference Finals against the Warriors where they got swept. Durant wasn't even playing. Remember, Durant got hurt in the Houston series, came back, played like 12 minutes against Toronto in the finals. So when you say, has Dame Lillard ever had like a real sniff of playoff success? Not really, because even though they were in the Western Conference Finals, it didn't feel like they were a real contender with it. But the conversation on the podcast started getting into like, how are you going to reconcile your career if you end this whole thing without a ring? And Redick was very open, going like, look, I talked to my therapist about it. It was hard for me to move on from it. And they both said some similar things. But to focus on what Lillard said, it was like, look, I did it the right way, where he even followed up as soon as he said it, saying, this is not me knocking super teams, but it was also him reminding everybody that he wasn't pursuing a super team to get out of there, to get out of Portland, although that's TBD considering where this goes and some of his recent comments saying, I don't want to be here for a rebuilding phase. He said, look, whether it's the relationships, the money you put together, like I'll have a fulfilled career if this is all that it is. And I couldn't help but think, even though most of us, me talking and all of us listening aren't pro athletes, like I could say it, but that's probably what I would say if I didn't win a ring. Like I would find some way to process feeling good about what is an incredible opportunity to be able to be a Hall of Famer and have this kind of career, but never have the ultimate goal. So you'll kind of come up with some other stuff being like, hey, look, I know that's the goal, but man, did I have a lot of fun and did I do all these great things, knowing deep down if you had actually won one, you'd be like, yeah, a lot of that other stuff is kind of bullshit. Lillard's 32, as I mentioned, will be 33 this summer. He's just at about 20,000 points for his career. 10,000 points from now seems a little lofty, not impossible. Players are playing longer than ever, shooting age as well. Although his quickness off the dribble and getting into open spots, that would diminish at some point. So if it's not 10,000, because 10,000 more points is going to put him as a top 10 scorer of all time, knowing that there will be other people moving up that are still playing. Let's say 8,000 points, that would put him right now at 10th, just ahead of Moses Malone. So what do you do with Dame? If that's what it is, but the playoff resume is a continuation of what it's been throughout his entire career. Like, can you say he's good 5 years after he's retired? Can you say, granted, good is silly, but can you say he's one of the greats? And as I remind us all, those aren't, the rules are that you're not allowed to do that. Like, how many Chris Paul arguments do you think I'm winning in 10 years? Not many. Not looking forward to those. And I'm going to get to some of the playoff pressure with certain groups and certain players that we have and kind of separating those two. And that's why I think Lillard's a really good example of this, because as great as he's been and as great as the final numbers will be, you'll go, okay, but, he wasn't really Steph. The Kyrie conversation's always very difficult. Just going like, what am I going to do with him historically? Westbrook's been this complete 180 as far as like, I think what people thought he was and the impact that he had to now going to all of these different teams where it seems like, how do we even find a way to fit him in if he's not the ball dominant player? He was in Oklahoma City. And I don't want to turn this whole Westbrook thing again. I think it's all been said. But what it got me thinking about was that maybe Lillard just is in that group that doesn't have the pressure on him that the other players have, that we know. Like, there's no real debate. Like, we know who the best 5 or 6 are. And those guys end up taking all the shit. So there's really good players where when they don't have playoff success, we just kind of shrug, where it's like, wait, if Lillard got a ring at 36 with another team, then we're all of a sudden going to pretend he was a different dude? Like, that doesn't seem like that makes any sense. So as far as like making the point of, well, if he wasn't that guy, isn't this actually all playing out the way it's supposed to? Because if he was actually one of those dudes and that much better, then he'd have better playoff success. And we'd give him more credit for doing it on his own instead of joining up with somebody else. Because that's the other weird part of it too. Like, imagine having a Damian Lillard argument with guys and he only makes it to the Western Conference Finals in 2019. And then someone says, yeah, but he did it the right way. Nobody's going to want to say that. You'd laugh at your friend for doing it that way. So when I look at Lillard, who's not even part of this conversation as we move it forward, because they're going to be out of the playoffs, 3.5 out of the play-in game, they're shutting it down, like whatever. I wanted to come up with kind of a definitive list, but also that separation, that line of separation where it's like, yeah, you're really good and you may make all NBA teams and you're going to have all these all-star appearances and you're going to be in the Hall of Fame and the final numbers are going to be incredible. But you were kind of below this line of pressure. All right. So if I look at the number one guy, it's going to be Jokic. It's his 5th playoff season coming up. He had the Western Conference Finals in the bubble year against the Lakers. I don't think many people gave Denver much of a chance. The Suns in 4 sweep was bad because it felt like, and something that I'll be looking at here, if Denver goes far in the playoffs, it's like, wait, will Jokic become somewhat of a liability defensively, even though I do think his activity on defense is better than the internet would have you believe, but it's just never going to look as good with him because visually it never looks as good, and he's not as good as some of the other, he's clearly not as good defensively as some of the other dominant big men. But I don't even count the Golden State 5-game series loss last year. Monty Morris was their number 2 scorer. The team was hit by injuries. So last year's run. But if Jokic has an early exit with all the MVP attention and how nasty that it's gotten this year, like get ready. If you don't like Jokic and they lose in the second round, it's going to be Christmas for you this summer. Number 2, and this could be 3, so 3 could be 2, but as of right now, it's Harden and Embiid. I've already talked about Harden too much already. I'm not going to anymore. We all get the conversation around him in the playoffs. But Joel's going into his 6th playoff run. He's had 4 second-round exits. Last year against Miami, he missed the first 2 games early. Like, I don't care about that one. The Atlanta one is on Ben Simmons. It's not an Embiid. But this is a dude that might win the MVP this year that's clearly a top 5 player that is above that line of pressure where you're supposed to have all this pressure, where I still think, and I mentioned this on Sunday with Bill, I'm not suggesting, hey, we should shit on these guys more. That's not what I'm doing. But for whatever reason, and I think it's because he is actually so liked, which is the opposite of how he seems to feel about himself, that he has not reached that what's going on with this guy phase. Maybe locally in Philly, but not nationally. If you look at national shows and all of the content out there, Embiid is not in the crosshairs like other players of his stature, which is fine. I'm okay with it. But he's kind of like on deck behind Jokic here. The reason I say the Harden-Embiid combo is number 2 and could be number 3, because if the Suns come back with Durant's in an entirely different category. He's already got the rings. They're probably the most downgraded rings of any modern superstar, which is silly because, as I mentioned minutes ago, I thought for a while there, for a 2-year stretch, I wouldn't have taken anyone ahead of him. But if Durant comes back, it's almost like he's at 0. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that's what the perception is of him joining one of the great teams of all time with Golden State, where it's like, yeah, he got his rings, but like, just be honest with me. If you're not a Durant fan, not necessarily even anti-Durant, you probably diminish those a little bit more than some of the other ones, even if those were constructed as well with super teams. Chris Paul, it just hasn't looked as good. It just hasn't. Trust me, I'm watching every night, hoping I see some sign. I got really excited for a couple of weeks there in January. I'm not even sure if after what happened against Dallas last year and blowing the 2-0 lead against the finals, I don't even know if anybody's like, anti-Chris Paul people are just like, dude, you're still talking, right? And I get it. And then Booker kind of skates in a way where he would have more of this pressure on him if Durant weren't there, or if it weren't this Chris Paul thing going on for a decade and a half. Then there's a drop-off. In the Clippers, because Kawhi's already got his rings, Paul George has got the injury. They put this team together. They put all the resources into it. It looks like it's supposed to be better. They've had some nice stretches, but the George injury changes everything. So if the Clippers are out early, especially when you start looking at like where these 4-5 matchups are and how 4, 5, 6 and beyond are going to shake out, if Durant comes back, will teams be tanking the last couple of days, hoping to get out of that 4-5 matchup and much rather play against Memphis or Sacramento? Absolutely. Like that will happen. And I don't blame teams for wanting to do it. But the Clippers, because it's been so long and disappointing and the uncertainty, and here we go again, another chapter in the injury history of this group, I feel like it's kind of a wash, and Kawhi already has his hardware. And George is in that second group, which is kind of like the Jimmy Butler group. Jimmy Butler's a terrific player. Look at the numbers from last year. He might be all NBA again this year. The team isn't as good. That might work against him with the voters. But Butler doesn't carry the same burden, not even close, as the other dominant wing players. Giannis I could put on this list only because of second ring pressure, that if you really are going to go down as one of the all-time greats, right? Like we're talking when it's all said and done, could Giannis be top 10 of all time? He's tracking that way. He'd need another one. So with Giannis, we're not even there yet. It would have to happen a few more years. And trust me, it will happen because this is what we do. Memphis too young, Sacramento too young, Golden State, the whole group, they got their extra ring, it feels like last season. Luka's still too young. Trey, as great as the numbers are, probably has way more to do with like figuring out his own role on the team as opposed to where he is in the standing of all of this stuff. And I already hit on Butler. Tatum really could be number 4 here. And my perception of all of this could be off. You could have different ones. I think I pay enough attention to this stuff. Tatum last year in the NBA playoffs, most points, most assists, did play in more games because they reached the finals. The Eastern Conference Finals losses with him don't bother me as much because I feel like a few of those were actually just way ahead of schedule as the organization was like, wait, I guess we're in the Eastern Conference Finals. Miami lost, whatever. I thought Miami was the better team. They didn't have an answer for Bam. But all the Tatum stuff wasn't exactly great in the finals. It felt a little stagnant. He came back. He was a better player, and he was in that MVP conversation. But since the All-Star break, he hasn't looked as good. He was terrific in Sacramento. The team hasn't looked as good. I believe he's good enough that he will figure it out. And the Celtics probably put together some kind of run here when everybody's healthy. But they're not going to be the favorites coming out of the East. I don't think anybody in their right mind would pick a healthy Boston against a healthy Milwaukee. But with Tatum, there's kind of that slight line. It's not solid, bold, black ink. It's just kind of, it's faded a bit, but there does feel like there's a little bit of a line in that separation of who he is. And that really comes down to status. The status you have in the league is the price that you pay when it comes to pressure. Every one of these stars wants that status. Most of them, even though they need help, want to kind of be the guy. And you have to kind of go through getting your ass kicked enough to go, maybe I don't always want to be the guy, or maybe I'd like another guy. Because everybody needs another guy. So when it's all said and done about any of these players, the status while you play, you may have reached your goals, but because of it, the price you'll pay will end up costing you much more historically.